Next speaker is Sophia Lemieux from the class of 2022, with her talk about what school doesn't teach you about reading. Off to you, Sophia.
So I had always had phases with reading. You know how your parents always tell you to read and you just really don't want to, yet they nag and they nag and they nag you about it? Or maybe your history teacher assigned you a chapter in a textbook that's not only long and maybe uninteresting, but the teeny tiny font makes it just a pain to read. And then one day, they stop. It happens to be a day where your parents don't nag you, and your history teacher just hasn't assigned you a chapter today. And starting from that day, for maybe 2.12 weeks, you are a reading machine. You read 200 pages in the span of 30 minutes. All of your free time is consumed by this book. You can't think of anything from this book. You literally cannot sleep because you are reading this book. And then one day, you just kind of stop, even while you're in the middle of the story. It seems that this flame of reading that you had is just kind of dead, like randomly. And then you don't pick up the book for another 2 months, and by then you've forgotten the first half. As I got more interested in science, in the brain more specifically, I found a passion for understanding how the brain handles day-to-day tasks, such as walking, talking, doing the dishes, things that we take for granted. And then I landed on reading. How do we read? How does an organ, a muscle smaller than our big intestine, accomplish something that we think of as so simple, yet when we look deeper into it, is extraordinarily complicated? So here I am telling you stuff that I learned in a book that I read, ironically, with the same method that I just explained to you. So here is what school doesn't tell you about reading. Now, when I first made this presentation, and I presented it to other people in my close circle, they always told me, Sophia, you have too much text on your slide. It's too distracting. And I told myself, well, no, pictures are more distracting. And then I looked back on my own presentation and I realized, when I first showed you this slide, what did you look at first? The adorable picture of the cute, fluffy little kitten, or the long paragraph of lorem ipsum gibberish? I bet I can say that most of you, dare I say all of you, looked at the cat picture first. Whether you're a cat person or not, the cat picture was generally easier for your brain to process and to look at than all of the gibberish that's on the right, and I'm going to explain to you why. Now, how do we read? That's the big question. So written word processing starts in our eye. There's only one part of our eye in the very back called the fovea that has a dense amount of cells that can read small print. This means that there's not a large surface of our eye that can discern small print that's, for example, in history textbooks or in Shakespeare novels. This means that our eye has to rapidly move across the page to be able to read everything that's on the page in a movement called stackades. So while you think that you're always seeing the page like that, in reality, it actually looks like this. When your eye stops, you only look at one or two letters at a time, maybe one word if it's a simple word like and or I or was. Your eyes decompose the word into fragments that your brain then has to bring back together into one word. You know how sometimes you're reading and you read and you read and you read and you read, and then you've read 15 pages now, and then you sit back and you think, I don't remember a single thing that I just read. Even though when you're sitting there reading it, you're thinking, yeah, I'm taking all this information in, but then you realize that, no, you're not. This is because when you read, your brain needs lots of energy and concentration. If you're thinking about what you had for lunch because it was really, really delicious, or that one funny thing your friend said 2 weeks ago, you're not giving your brain the concentration and the energy it needs to read. Like I said before, the brain has to reconstruct word fragments and put them together so that it can define what the word is so that we can read. This is a process that we usually take for granted because, well, it seems so easy to us once we've learned how to do it. What's another fascinating thing to think about is that when I showed you all these word lists, you can read them all the same. whether some of them are different fonts, colors, sizes, some of them are into different, some of them are italic, some of them are bold. Yet you can read them all the same way, instinctively, naturally. This means that in the mental dictionary inside of our brain that our eyes have access to, not only are there compartments that hold individual letters, but there's also compartments within those compartments within those compartments so that our brain can identify different letters and those different forms of the letters. And by now, probably even in the beginning, you realize that, well, the final series of words is different. Yet you can read Jello Book Run differently than Hello Cook Fun instantly. This shows the precision that our brain has to identify different characters and different words as well. Even though Jello and hello only have a one letter difference, we can still read it differently. So that just shows how well our eyes can discern characters and how well our brain can organize through them. Now, there's two major processing routes when we read. The phonological route, which is reading out loud, and the lexical route, which is reading in your head. So the phonological route is more used by young children that are learning how to read. I say that it's more used by young children because when you read out loud, you're allowing your brain the full concentration to read. When you read out loud, you're not able to think about other things because the oral part helps your brain concentrate more. It's also helpful for just everyday life because if you're reading, I don't know, a Shakespeare book and you encounter some ridiculously long old word that you need to read out loud to decompose, this allows you to have possibly a pronunciation and hopefully a definition thanks to root, prefix, and suffix. Now, on the other hand, there's the lexical route. Now, lots of us, especially people my age, use the lexical route when we read because it's just faster. The lexical route means that your eyes simply look at the characters and then it's sent to the brain and the brain processes it without any help of auditory sounds. This means that although auditory helps when we read, it's not necessary. Back when people first started creating languages and reading, people reading in their head was very strange because not many people were literate. And the phonological route was more commonly used because the people that were literate would read out loud to people. So the people that did read in their head were seen to have some magical talent. The lexical route is actually very fascinating because it shows how your eyes and your brain have a direct connection. Now, another important part is what part of the brain makes us read. Now, the discovery of this goes very far back. So there was this guy, a scientist, a neurologist more precisely, in the 19th century called Joseph Desjardins. Now, one day a man comes to Joseph Desjardins and he says, Joseph Desjardins, I just suffered from a stroke and I can't read anymore. And well, back in the 19th century, reading was like the only form of entertainment unless you wanted a big dinner party. So that was kind of not good for the man. And so naturally, being a scientist, Joseph Desjardins did some tests. He read to the man could still understand words. He had many conversations with the man, and the man could still produce words. And when presented with a pen and paper, he could still write words with very little spelling mistakes. But when Desjardins told him to look back at what he had wrote and correct the spelling mistakes that he did make, the man just couldn't do it. So when the man did die, Joseph Desjardins extracted his brain to see what was the cause of the problem. Now, what it turned out to be is that the seizure that the man had caused basically there was a lesion, there's the word, in the back of the left hemisphere of the man's brain. Now, what this lesion did is it disconnected the eyes from the brain. What Joseph Desjardins had just discovered was one of the first cases of pure Alexia, or in this case, pure Alexia without Agrafia. Now, what is pure Alexia without Agrafia? Pure Alexia without Agrafia is the visual equivalent to word deafness. To elaborate this a bit more, let's say that there is a word embossed onto a surface. Now, a word embossed onto a surface means that it's just really pressed into something, for example, leather. If a person with pure Alexia without Agrafia closes their eyes and traces the word with their finger, they can identify, okay, this is an E, this is an A, this is an L, whatever. Yet the lesion is still creating a disconnect between the eyes and the brain. So this means that there's not the lesion didn't destroy the mental dictionary and the compartments that we have in the brain. It simply disconnected the eyes from the brain. A person suffering from pure Alexia without Agrafia can still look at letters and see them perfectly clearly. He doesn't need prescription glasses. He doesn't see letters blurry. It's simply as if he was looking at a foreign language. When we look at, for example, Asian languages that are more focused on sound and have sound characters that are very different from the ones that we are used to here, when we look at them, it's not that the characters are blurry, we just don't know what they mean. It's like for another example, it's like ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. When we look at them, we can say, okay, like that looks like a bird and that looks like some sort of funky L. They're not blurry, we just don't know what they mean. So that's what happens to a person with pure Alexia without Agrafia. Now, thanks to more modern science, we have learned that the parts of the brain that listen to words, read words, associate words, and produce words. The funny thing is that the brain is using different parts to do all these tasks that we seem to associate together. When it listens to words and when it reads words, it's two different parts of the brain. It's funny how the brain evolved in a certain way where tasks that we associate as being similar really just aren't when it comes to the brain. It's its own system. Now, so what? You've just listened to me lecture for about 10 minutes about how we read, but what are you supposed to take from this? A lot of times these days, people go to the gym to exercise their muscles. They lift weights to exercise their arms. They go on a run to exercise their heart and their legs and whatever other things people do at the gym. Yet we aren't exercising our brains anymore, or a lot less than we used to. As I said before, in the 19th century, one of the man's only form of fun was reading. Whereas nowadays we have computers and video games and our phones and the internet and friends that we can talk to easily from FaceTime. Yet we never really think that, oh, I'm bored. Instead of, I don't know, browsing Instagram for 5 hours, why don't we read? Especially in times like these where we keep saying, I'm bored, and then we end up going on TikTok for 5 hours. Why don't we instead pick up a book? Reading is a task that we need every day. We need it to read signs on the road. We need it to read that English book that we don't want to read. We need it to read the ingredients on a cereal box to make sure it doesn't have any gluten in it. Yet we aren't training this skill. When we read more and more, it becomes easier, faster, becomes less tedious, and yet we don't want to make the effort to get there. So I think that especially in times like these, why don't we all go out there and we spend like an hour to just train our brains? Thank you. And back to you, Arthur.